Chapter 6, Section 1, Genetic Emotional History of Women. Throughout this chapter, we start to become even more aware of the differences between women's emotional behavioural patterns picked up throughout millions of years of women's different emotional events that have been very different to the emotional events and activities of men, but have caused a slight genetic size increase to occur in certain areas in women's brain, as you will discover shortly. But before we begin to describe these differences, we must first remind ourselves of three very important aspects of the brain of all men and all women. First, that all men and all women have the same brain areas as each other, even if some of these areas may differ slightly in size because of the different emotional activities between each gender. Secondly, that only the power, strength and control of some extreme ego, fear or hurt personal emotions that have taken over control in the long-term memory are able to activate our more serious ancient ancestors' primitive genetic emotions that are stored in our genetic memory, the amygdala. This is important to remember because most of our female ancestors' emotional behavioural patterns are slightly more complex than our male ancestors' emotional behavioural patterns, as you will discover shortly. And thirdly, we must refer back to the General Genetics chapter 4, to remind ourselves of how thousands of past generations of our women ancestors have genetically inherited and passed on through their genes to each female offspring born some of women's different emotional behavioural patterns because of the different emotional activities throughout millions of years of our female ancestors' history that were mostly unrecognisable. But it is very important for us all to now begin to recognise these different emotional behaviours, because we have no idea that our ancestors are still evolving certain areas in our female brains today. But please be aware also that these small examples found throughout Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 are simply a few of my own findings, but have been backed up with independent scientific research evidence that can be found in the index at the back of this book. Because as mentioned earlier at the beginning of this book, our human brains are highly complex, and I am not a neuroscience expert and do not claim to be, and therefore there may be many other areas in our brain that have not yet been discovered by neuroscience experts but have been genetically influenced by our different ancestors' male and female emotional activities. So what emotional events have our female ancestors gone through throughout our human history that were totally unlike the emotional events of our male ancestors? Not all, but most girls throughout most of our past ancestors' history grew up with a far easier upbringing than boys. Girls, in general, were not taught from a very early age that they would need to be prepared to face physical aggression and physical conflicts or even physical violence. And most girls were not taught to be the breadwinners and to face their fears, show no emotional fears, and go out to physically defend the home, families and countries from invasions or even invade other countries. These were mainly the duties of our male ancestors. Instead, in past history, girls were brought up throughout very early childhood and taught to be the home providers for food, warmth, health, comfort, and to become the emotional nurturer for the children and to keep the family unit strong, come what may. However, in our current time today, this is now beginning to change, because many girls are growing up today wanting both a career and to bring up a family. This is a huge challenge, but this is another story, because throughout this chapter we are going to discuss the past millions of years of our female ancestors' emotional history. As well as we all know, throughout thousands of generations, women have been the main emotional family providers, bringing up children and caring for our homes, being the caregivers, the nurturers, the housekeepers, and protecting and keeping our children, husband and family unit together. But let us take a few moments to remind ourselves of what and how women's different emotional events have evolved our female ancestors' emotional behaviours throughout thousands of generations. Young girls growing up would have been emotionally influenced by their own mother's emotions and behaviours, to be taught to develop their natural motherly instincts of nurturing, giving and providing a safe, warm and comfortable, protective home for all future children. This meant that throughout our human history, most young women would first have had to seek out a suitable, healthy partner in order to produce healthy offspring. And second, most women would have been taught by their mothers to spend their lives in and around a home environment in order to bring up, protect and to keep safe the home, the children and to keep the family unit strong. This meant that throughout thousands of generations, women developed many different kinds of emotions and behaviours compared to our men friends. Because in order to seek out a suitable, healthy partner, most women, needed to develop a much higher state of emotional intuition. So what is intuition, and why have women evolved much more emotional intuition than men? Throughout millions of years of women's emotional struggles, bringing up children, nurturing, being a caregiver and providing the instinctual protection of our homes, we can be assured that this instinctual emotional protection began to become women's natural habits and emotional behaviours. All of our past female ancestors throughout thousands of generations will have passed these particular emotions through their genes and onto the next generation of female children born. So what is intuition, and why do most of our female ancestors hold more emotional intuition in general compared to most of our male ancestors? In past history, and for thousands of generations, women were not as sophisticated as they are today. In past history, women did not assess their compatibility with their partners as we do today. And women also didn't have marriage certificates to keep the family unit binding. For thousands of generations, women had to intuitively choose a man that she thought would be fertile to procreate and give her healthy offspring. At the same time, she needed to also intuitively decide if this particular man would stay loyal so that she could continue to keep the family unit strong and have a provider for the family's food, comfort, warmth and security. In other words, this was how women began to develop more of their natural instincts that we call intuition. Of course, they did not know if the man they selected was going to bring them healthy children, and so for millions of years all that women could go by would be their intuitive emotional senses. This is why women would spend hours questioning and ruminating, trying to heighten these intuitive emotional senses of whether a particular male partner was going to be a strong, loyal, fertile and healthy partner, and hope that these intuitions were correct. And so throughout the generations, women had to develop and evolve these heightened intuitive senses. Similarly, women also used these intuitive emotions in order to guide her emotional senses to protect her children. Mothers would have to intuitively sense if their child needed feeding, was sick, cold, hot or hungry, etc. It became a natural intuitive instinct for most women. At the same time, throughout thousands of past generations, women would most definitely not have had the sophistication of order within society as we have today. There was no such thing as contracts or legal documents and vows such as marriage certificates to keep couples legally tied and bonded together. Throughout thousands of past generations, men would have run lawless within societies, and women would have had to create a much higher sense of awareness, intuitively picking up with their emotional intuitive senses whether their male partners were straying. This not knowing meant that women's emotional senses, in other words, women's intuition, became much more heightened to other threats from other women. Women's heightened intuitive senses had to come from the not knowing, and therefore all threats from other women were discussed with other women within the community, and this is why women spent a great deal more time questioning, doubting, and intuitively ruminating over their emotions. And in extreme emotional circumstances, once these threats were confirmed, this is how women's non-physical but verbal aggressive emotions would begin to take aggressive emotional verbal action. However, this is where women's emotional behaviours get slightly more complex, so bear with me, because while trying to process whether these intuitive emotions were correct or not, women would ruminate through great contemplation, giving serious thought to whether these intuitive emotions were correct or not, and this developed cross-communication in this area in our brain, the corpus callosum, that allowed different areas in the brain to become activated to make these difficult decisions. But these emotional activations always began with women's ego-emotional thought patterns, and through neural networks, these ego emotions would communicate this information to ruminate in other areas in the brain that neuroscience experts refer to as the corpus callosum, that is positioned over and around the cerebral cortex, that then allowed this cross-communication to take place through billions of neurons firing up backwards and forwards through emotional rumination. What this simply means is that throughout thousands of generations, women's different emotional activities genetically evolved a slight size difference in this area in our human brain called the corpus callosum. And in many different independent scientific research studies, these studies found that the corpus callosum is relatively larger in women's brains compared to men's brains, but its function is said to allow different parts of the human brain to cross-communicate with each other. The corpus callosum is positioned over and around the cerebral cortex. However, this is where it gets a little more complicated, because once one of our female ancestors confirmed through this cross-communication and rumination that their male partner was straying, her ego behavioural patterns would rise to the surface of her long-term memory and take over control of all logical and rational emotional information stored in the long-term memory that would then activate her ancient ancestors' primitive genetic memory, the amygdala, to recall her ancient ancestors' emotional fear and intuitive emotions. However, once a decision had been made that her male partner was straying, instead of reacting to the other women or the other woman with physical aggression or violent actions, most women would revert back to her personal adult ego behavioural patterns and instead react with extreme ego aggressive verbal emotional actions, such as extreme gossiping, breaking confidences, extreme backstabbing, being over-judgmental, extreme criticising the outsider's appearance or personality, even ostracism, etc. I have tried to make these genetic differences between our male and female ancestors' emotional behaviours as simplified as possible. However, they are an extremely complex set of emotional behaviours because, as we have mentioned many times before, and as most neuroscience experts would agree, all areas in our brain are highly complex. Nonetheless, in general, this is how each new generation of our female offspring born throughout millions of years began to evolve this slight genetic size difference in this area in our female ancestors' brains, the corpus callosum. Therefore, I recommend that you begin your own research, and to help you, you can refer to a few independent scientific research studies that identify this slight size difference found in the index at the back of this book. However, although there are quite a few independent scientific research studies that describe this slight size difference in this area in women's brains, the corpus callosum, the reasons for these slight genetic size differences between men and women's brains have yet to be resolved by independent scientific research experts. I also discovered that many of these independent scientific research studies have been conducted on animals. And as I explained in many previous chapters, I have not included these independent research studies in the index simply because I am totally against research on animals simply for the reasons of our own human benefits, because all animals deserve the respect and dignity just like all humans. At the same time, animal research proves absolutely nothing about the millions of years of our own human emotional behavioural patterns that have all been influenced by all of our different male and female ancestors' emotional events. Another form of ancient intuition comes from our gut reactions or gut emotional senses, because our gut is also a very ancient memory. Because when someone says that they had a hunch or they went by a gut feeling, this means that they may have been connecting with their ancient intuitive emotional senses. These are accessible senses to all men and all women, because our gut is able to connect with different primitive but complex emotional senses. But once triggered, our gut senses activates a new neural synapse and transfers through a new neural network this new emotional information to become involuntarily stored into our long-term memories through the help of this complex brain process, neuroplasticity. Do you remember in the very first few chapters of this book when we discussed how our very earliest personal, childhood, involuntary, illogical, irrational, ego, fear or hurt emotions become stored into our long-term memories? This is because throughout our very early childhood, our very young brains can only function through emotions and feelings that first become triggered through our heart and gut emotional senses. And once activated, our gut senses create a new neural synapse that transfers this emotional information unknowingly and involuntarily to become stored into our long-term memories through the help of this complex brain process, neuroplasticity. This is why we would all become much more wise if we began to listen more closely to our heart and gut emotional senses, including myself, whenever we need to make quick, urgent and complex life-changing decisions, because our guts will never ever let us down, although Many times our gut intuition is not what we really want to hear. However, instead of many of us heeding these warnings from our guts, we simply ignore these senses, only to find later that our gut was so very right. On the other hand, we may be very scared to make a life-changing risk or decision of some kind, something that we know will have a life-changing effect on our lives. And through our ego fear, we just didn't have the courage to do it. So we back off, and sometime later down the road, we regret that we didn't have the courage, when all the time our gut told us to just go for it. On the other hand, we may be acting in a way that is criminal or will harm others in some way. Again, before we act, our gut senses will tell us and warn us. Many of us never listen to our guts. We simply don't take this internal, natural, ancient knowledge and guidance seriously. I would like to draw your attention to an independent scientific research study below that may give us all clues to some very important emotional attributes of another area in our brain that is connected to the corpus callosum, and that we are going to discuss in the second half of this book, section 2, because this area in our brain may be able to help us all transform our lives only for our highest and greatest good, as you will discover shortly. The cerebral cortex, plural cortices, also known as the cerebral mantle, is the outer layer of neural tissue of the cerebrum, of the brain in humans and other mammals. It is separated into two cortices by the longitudinal fissure that divides the cerebrum into the left and right cerebral hemispheres. The two hemispheres are joined beneath the cortex by the corpus callosum. The cerebral cortex is the largest site of neural integration in the central nervous system. It plays a key role in attention, perception, awareness, thought, memory, language, and consciousness. It is difficult for us to recognize that we are all not so very different from our ancestors, and that both men and women are still genetically linked to our ancestors' past behavioural patterns through our genes. However, now that we know a little more about our human evolutionary emotions and behaviours, I hope that this information will make us all begin to acknowledge that we are much more connected to our past ancestors than we ever knew possible. And this is also why some other of mankind's more advanced altruistic emotions that we all have and that we are going to discuss in the second half of this book have many solutions and many huge attributes for our own individual personal advancement and for the positive and peaceful collective advancement for the future of all of mankind. However, many of us have suppressed many of our highly evolved altruistic emotions because of the development of more highly influential ego behavioural patterns that we have already discussed throughout Chapter 3, including myself. This is why, once we discover the solutions to become dominant with our highly evolved altruistic emotions, we will all find the secrets to all live a life that feels like paradise here on earth. This is why all of these discussions will have to wait until the second half of this book, section 2, because first, in this next chapter, we need to briefly explain how we have all developed some of our different memories through this very important natural process called neuroplasticity, and why neuroplasticity is such an extremely important function that has all the potential to help us all in the future with some of these brand new, positive, personal, voluntary, advanced emotional transformations.